I'm a fifth-generation artist. Family lore indicates that it actually dates back as early as Paul Revere's Silver Shop. So, I started working with my dad when I was 10, and then I've worked, in a lot of ways, I'm a professional studio assistant. I've been working for artists all over the country, along with the different foundries I've been in. Then I met Richard, who had been making sculpture full-time since he was 23. And so he literally made sculpture every day for 70-some years. Successful abstract art is and this is what Richard leaned into, was stuff that really, like I said, tugging at the subconscious. His perfect space was inside the studio and just banging on metal and
Right.
I mean, that was actually his mantra near the end and stuff like that. What are we going to do today, Richard? We're going to go to studio and bang on metal.
Stay informed, stay competitive, and stay connected to the industry with The Fabricator magazine. Every issue covers the latest processes, equipment, and best practices in metal fabrication, plus perspectives from people who are solving real problems on the shop floor every day. Join thousands of subscribers and sign up for The Fabricator for free at thefabricator.com.
Hello, welcome to this episode of the Fabricator Podcast. My name is Dan Davis with the Fabricator Magazine, and my fellow host is
Lincoln Bruner with the Fabricator magazine.
Thank you for joining us today, Lincoln.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in as well. Today's guest is Eric W. Stephenson of Lunar Burn Studio. We're going to talk about his career as an artist, his experience working with metal, and his relationship with a kind of an icon in art, sculpture, Richard Hunt of Chicago.
Yeah.
And I think the conversation is going to be enlightening as well as informative, because before we had invited Eric to be a guest on our podcast, I wasn't aware of just how far-reaching Richard Hunt was as an artist.
Just reading up on this guy, I mean, he was very active in the civil rights movement. He was kind of a pioneer type artist when it comes to 3D, welding art in this country. And I'm surprised I hadn't heard of him before. Just having worked here for many years, I was particularly impressed with just how many different pieces that he's done, and the geographic reach of his work. It's coast to coast.
170 solo exhibitions. His work is featured in 125 plus museums around the world.
Oh,
He's created 120 plus public commissions across 24 states and Washington, D.C. It's incredible.
it is.
Yeah.
And I really liked his. You'll hear it, of course, later on. But his mention of just how well artists are treated in places like Europe, as opposed to here. But just how well he's thought of overseas is kind of cool.
Well, I think that's why Eric and the rest of the Richard Hunt Foundation have done such a good job of, carrying on the legacy of Richard Hunt. And if you go to website richardhuntsculptor.org, you'll learn all about him and his work with even President Obama Center and the African American Cultural Museum in Washington D.C. His stuff is all over the place.
Yeah, he's everywhere in his sphere. He was everywhere.
Yeah.
Yep, and I think we covered a little bit of that. So there'll be a test at the end. Be sure and pay attention and get your pencils out. And Gareth will personally send you the test form in the mail.
Yeah.
So be on the lookout for it.
Well, or a button or a pin, or a pen, or a T-shirt or a sticker.
Send us that comment to podcast@fmamfg.org, and you'll be sure to get the test form, T-shirt, button, and one fountain pen.
Yeah, we've got a lot to give away. So
I took this way off topic, but anyway, you'll enjoy this episode of the Fabricator Podcast with Eric W. Stephenson, metal artist and person in charge of furthering the legacy of Richard Hunt.
Yeah.
Thank you and enjoy.
SparkForce scholarships are now open, and this is your chance to take the next step in your manufacturing career. Whether you're in a technical program, trade school, or pursuing advanced training, SparkForce scholarships can help reduce financial barriers and get you closer to the job you want. Applications are now being accepted. Learn more and apply at sparkforce.org. And now, back to the episode.
Thanks for joining us today, Eric. Looking forward to the conversation. Can you give our audience a little bit of knowledge about yourself?
Yeah, where to start here? I mean, if we want to go back to the beginning of time, I'm a fifth generation artist. Family lore indicates that it actually dates back as early as Paul Revere's silver shop.
No kidding.
Wow.
Not Paul Revere, but other artisans that worked in his silver shop, because we have a bunch of his silver and stuff from that era.
No kidding.
In the family collection and whatnot. But more directly, and it's really fifth generation, fourth, and stuff. And so it was, my dad's a sculptor, his mom was a painter, her father was a painter, and actually the first art professor in Montana.
Wow.
Okay.
So anyway, so it's like going early on, I stuttered quite a bit, and so I never felt comfortable, verbally.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just hide out in the backyard playing with Hot Wheels and making mud castles and forts, and kind of like what normal kids did. And with my dad being an artist, he facilitated that, encouraged it and everything. But it wasn't until actually the pyrotechnic tendencies came out when I about when I was 10.
God bless America.
And my dad found me in the basement of our family house, sticking the wooden broom handle into the oil furnace and sitting out and just pulling it, watching it burn.
Wow.
And so then he was just like, and I remember, didn't really get scolded, but I remember that I pretty much was always being taken to his studio after that. And it was
Get
funny.
scolded or scalded. Either one.
Yeah, it's like, well, both maybe. But yeah, then I wrote about that as part of my origin story in grad school. And then later on, my mom read that and was just like, that's not how I remember that. As a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, so that was my perception of the scenario. But my mom was like, no, it's like, we were scared you were going to burn the house down. And it was, he's like, he's your son. But my dad was a ceramic artist and sculptor and stuff, so he took me to studio, and I started learning about how to build kilns and burners and transformation, being creative all the time.
What kind of work did he do?
Like I said, it was ceramics, but it was more brick and tile.
Tile. Okay.
Architectural ceramics.
Okay.
And so we spent a couple sabbaticals when I was 7 and 12 in Mexico, and living in these little villages and making kilns out of, cow crap and oil, waste oil and burners and hubcaps and adobe and,
Every artist dream.
or going down to the river and digging up our own clay and, so the real kind of earthy approach to it. But then ultimately I was introduced to welding and casting in 8th grade shop class.
No kidding.
Back when there was shop class.
Yeah.
And then, that took me up through high school. And then when I finally declared myself as a art major in college, my dad was like, okay, reality check. You want to be creative, that's fine. But you want to be an artist, then you're going to go roll in and you need to do 10 times, 100 times more work than your peers.
Right.
Because, the percentage of people that go into art school and actually come out of it and with the ability to make a career out of it is finite.
Well, that's really interesting advice, because it's like a workman's like quality to achieving what could be success, is that you really have to commit yourself.
Right.
Did you get it right away?
Kind of. I mean, because I kind of grew up in that culture, and Dad was always about go to you went to studio every day. Period.
Yeah. Wow.
But at the same time, it's all about that. I remember one of my first early classes. I don't know whether it was 2D or 3D design, but I rolled into the first critique with 10 finished projects.
Wow. Yeah.
I literally took him literally. And very quickly, all my peers hated me.
Yeah.
But then I quickly learned, it's like going, okay, show what I thought was the best piece to the professor, and then after the class, be like, oh yeah, by the way,
Wow.
Right.
Hear all the other stuff.
Sounds like your dad was really setting you up to think about this as a business person in a way from the get-go. It's like, you got to be serious about this, about the whole making a living part.
Right. I mean, if you're going to art school to just go someplace hide because you think it's going to be easy.
Yeah.
That's just not the case if you actually want a career in art.
Yeah.
Right. So, what was your intent being an artist? Did you have to? Is it like any other major where you have to kind of maybe pick a lane to pursue, or do you
Well,
get exposed to a lot of different things?
Yeah, well, yeah, early part of undergrad, you know, it's a shotgun approach. You're taking 1,000 different classes, different disciplines, different materials. And then in grad school, it becomes a little bit more focused. I mean, technically, I majored in sculpture in undergrad. But as far as materiality, it was kind of all over the place, even though I already, like I said, already had a pre-fascination with fire in general. You know, so that was a lot of it. Although really quickly I learned that, you know, as much as I liked working at ceramics, which is my dad's material, is that ceramic breaks.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, it's like the idea of creating in ceramic, but then transforming it into metal, you know, really became my fascination, and it's still my primary focus.
Wow.
So your studio here in Chicago is called Lunar Burn.
Yeah, Lunar Burn Studios.
What's the idea behind that name?
It was actually that came up when I was in. I went to grad school down in Houston, and it was just hotter than shit most of the year. And so to the point I didn't work in the daytime. It was just too hot and stuff. So I worked only at night. So midnight oil, lunar burn, the moon on fire, lunar burn.
Yeah,
That's where all it kind of came about.
Wow.
very cool. And one thing I'm very curious about in your work and in any artist's work, but yours in particular, as you began to develop as an artist, as a working artist, making your living, what are some things that you discovered early on that you're like, okay, this is really what I love. This is really what I want to really dig my hands into.
Right. I mean, as far as for me and stuff like that, I mean, how I make money has always been secondary to actually making the art.
Okay.
You know, even though I have made a career of it, I have that, you know, that same raw drive that my dad had, and certainly even further instilled as I worked with Richard Hunt, to go to studio every day, be creative, and making a living as an artist and stuff like that. I don't exclusively make a living selling my objects. You know, I've certainly had years where I do that. I have taught on and off over the years. Obviously, the last 2 decades I was with Richard, and so, you know, every day, as long as I'm creative every day and, you know, being functioning and solving problems, then I call that a win. You know, and however that manifests itself as the dollar sign.
Yeah.
You know, to pay the rent so I can make more art.
Yeah.
Well, I think sometimes people kind of focus on the revenue part of it and kind of miss the boat, and that's how you kind of get lost a little bit.
Right.
Your art comes first and the dollars come second. What are some things that you've particularly latched onto as an artist when it comes to the ideas or the concepts you're trying to get through? In other words, you know, what are some main themes in your work that you can see over the years?
Right. I mean, from my personal work, I love the human form, and so that's really the core of the work.
Okay.
As much as possible, I work with, you know, a variety of dancers, rock climbers, as of late, a bunch of circus performers, aerialists. I'm really fascinated with bodies that are fighting gravity. You know, I mean, and the idea, the premise of body language. So, you know, like as we're sitting here, obviously we're kind of counter to each other, but we're all at the same level. Or if you meet someone in the hallway, you're both, you know, all of our feet are on the ground, and we're usually squared off with someone, and so we know what kind of body language to interpret with that. Sorry about touching the mic. So we know about that, but what happens when we take the body out of context? How does that change the subconscious conversation of body language?
Interesting.
You know, and then I like abstraction. Like I said, I have a fascination with sci-fi, and so I've always been interested in wireframing, the idea of representing a three-dimensional object on a computer. So I take that as the lens of my abstraction in interpreting the human form.
Wow.
So did you build upon your welding interest as you got into your education and after that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I started off in 8th grade, and then even in college, my professors were like, okay, they really emphasized craftsmanship. And so they wouldn't actually critique me until my welding actually got to a certain level.
No kidding. Wow.
You know, and because really that came from a premise of, for the most part, most of society thinks artists are full of it, that we're basically con artists, in particular here in the U.S. In the U.S., the society as a whole really kind of look down on arts. They appreciate art, but they look down on us as a culture.
Yeah.
Whereas you go to anywhere else in the world, and you're borderline royalty.
Right.
You know, so it's this weird dichotomy. But the way we can, in the U.S., the way we can connect with our audience is through craftsmanship.
Sure.
Because even if you are just the blue collar welder, you'd be like, going, okay, I think that an artist might be, full of it, but at the same time, I look at it and say, those are nice beats. That's a nice grind.
Yeah.
Maybe he obviously spent, or he or she obviously spent a good bit of time on that object.
Right.
Maybe I'll give it a chance and at least be semi open to it, and that can be the pathway to a conversation.
Right. It's sort of like the idea of impress me first, and then I might talk to you.
Right.
Do you think that's especially hits home in the age of social media? Whereas, because we have a friend of the program. I feel like that's an
Friend of the
overused phrase.
podcast.
Yeah, friend of the podcast. Our friend Josh Welton from Detroit, and one of the things he's always writing about are the armchair welding experts on the internet.
Oh yeah.
Right.
But when it comes to having something stand out where maybe you don't have as many of those because the craftsmanship's so
Right.
good, that do you find that with your work on social media? Do you get kind of the armchairs
Yeah.
critics?
Do the haters come out?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, not so much that. Well, one, I don't post too much stuff that. I mean, my craftsmanship is pretty tight.
Yeah.
So I don't
Right.
come across that so much stuff with that. But the haters do come out in particular. Like so I do have been attempting to have a YouTube channel, and where it's teaching how to bronze cast, mostly specifically ceramic shell. And so, but yeah, the haters or the people, everyone's like, well, that's not how you do it, or this, everyone's like super critical on process.
Yeah.
So I've learned to be kind of strategic and careful about how I frame
Right.
things, certain conversations.
Yeah.
But yeah, social media is problematic, but it is how we connect to a larger audience.
Sure.
Yeah.
As opposed to being completely limited to the scope of what a gallery is.
Right. Well, I think it's a nice segue to talk about maybe. Can you talk about how you end up coming to Chicago and working with Richard Hunt, which is honestly a name that wasn't familiar to me until we were prepping for this conversation. And somebody had such a life that was like pre-social media, right? And so, could you kind of delve into that a little bit?
Yeah, as far as how I connected with Richard initially, my wife's an architect, and so we were bopping around the country, Houston, Boston, and stuff like that for our grad schools. And then it's like, okay, well, where do a sculptor and an architect go? And we've both been here for conferences, and we both loved the city. And to be fair, it was also an affordable city. Trying to be a sculptor out in the middle of a cornfield is really tough. And my wife focuses on urban design. So anyway,
natural fit.
Chicago rose to the top of the list really quickly, and so that's what dropped us here in 2001. And when I first got here, I volunteered with a group called Chicago Artists Coalition. And they still exist. So I was volunteering and stuffing envelopes back when envelopes were a thing.
Yeah.
Not to date myself too much. But in the process of working with them over a week or so, they gave me a list of like 40 names of sculptors in the city. So every night I would go home and just start cold calling each one of them. I'm like, my name's Eric Stephenson. I just moved to Chicago. What can you tell me about the city? Resources, studio spaces, gigs, whatever I could get a hold of. The upside of the Midwest, everyone was super friendly.
Yeah.
But for the most part, none of them really had any true suggestions other than that I need to go seek out Richard Hunt.
Wow.
When I got to about 2/3 of the way down the list, I came down to a name. It was a guy named Mike Helbing, who at the time, unbeknownst to me, was Richard's main guy. And so, but when the phone rang, they answered at Richard Hunt's studio. I'm like, well, in that case, let me talk to Richard. And they were like, well, he's not here at the moment. He'll be back around 2:00. But in the process of talking to the assistant that answered the phone, I found out his head welder had just quit. And so then anyway, I called back promptly at 2:00. Richard answers the phone. And I was just like, I understand there's an opportunity to be had. Can I come show you my portfolio? And I met him the next day.
Wow.
And we clicked, and I've been working with him ever since.
So you were assertive from the get-go with him. About
Coming out of Boston, Boston doesn't like sculptors. The only studios I could find had dirt floors.
Wow.
And stuff. So I really just, anyway, so when I got here, I was hungry. I went out of my way to make something happen. And so in that first 30 days, I scored a couple of fabricating gigs, doing gates for galleries. Had to come up with a studio space to do that. Scored my gig with Richard within the first 30 days.
Yeah.
And so, and then Chicago's just been rolling ever since.
That's awesome.
But at this point, you're in your mid 30s, and you're thinking, okay, I really want to make a go of this. What was your thought as a welder and someone who'd already been doing this for a number of years? What were your thoughts about the possibilities right then when you got in there?
Well, I mean, at that point, I was still thinking that my dream job was probably a tenure track job. Because, I mean, that's the one thing, you come through the school system, and it's basically, it produces the same of its own and stuff like that. So you go to, you go undergrad, grad school, and then you become a teacher.
Right.
But you can never really teach art. I mean, you can teach art, but you can't really teach how to make a living at art because you're actually making a living as teaching.
Correct.
Correct.
So there's always been that kind of weird disconnect within the educational system. I mean, there are exceptions. There are some fantastic programs that can do that, but by and large, there's like I said, a disconnect.
Right.
So with that said, when I first got here, I was thinking that was the case, but then I met Richard, who had been making sculpture full time since he was 23.
Yeah.
And really even a little bit before that. But at 23, he graduated from the Art Institute, sold his first sculpture to the MoMA, Museum of Fine Art in New York.
Wow.
And which is what exploded his career. And so he literally made sculpture every day for 70 some years.
Wow. So he started in the early 50s.
And so he was just like, education's over there and stuff like that. But he really taught me the big game. That's where the conversation of how to be an artist full time and exclusively an artist, really came into play.
So when you were going through that list when you first moved to Chicago, were you familiar with Richard Hunt before that? No.
Yeah, no, which is funny because it's like, I mean, I was in the sense that I remember there was a Richard Hunt in my textbooks.
Okay.
As a main guy. But it just never clicked. And apparently, at one point I was teaching at University of Houston in Clear Lake, which is where NASA is. And so when I'd walk to the admin building to pick up my paycheck, I was actually every day or every other week or whatever, I was walking by a Richard Hunt sculpture. It just happened to be on campus.
Wow.
Wow. So it even happens to artists as well.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. That's something else. So what was it like? What did you learn while you worked at Richard Hunt's studio? Was it? I mean, you came on as a welder.
So like you said, I mean, I was mid to late 30s at this point. I was well practiced and trained. Certainly became more proficient at working with some materials, but at this point, I'd also bopped all over the country, working in foundries from Montana to Texas to Boston, and so I was pretty dialed in that way. But what I really learned was the overall approach, and it picked up the mindset that my dad had instilled with me early on, as far as like, you do this every day.
Right.
The idea that, you think art, you dream art, you fascinate about art.
Yeah.
The idea that you let the creativity saturate every aspect of your being 24/7. And so, people will talk about, it's like, oh, well, I'm not in the mood to go to studio today because I'm not motivated or I don't have any inspiration. And it's like, screw that. That's not that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
What you do is you approach every aspect of it, of your life with creativity, and whether that's making the bed, baking a cake, mowing the lawn, mathematics, music, there's creativity in everything we do. And if you're in that constant mindset, when you finally roll into studio and you pick up the welder, you're already in that groove.
Right.
It's just a matter of pivoting a little bit, as opposed to like getting a beer or, finding some other way to kind of loosen yourself up or meditate or whatever works for you. And so really that's the practice that Richard instilled with me, right from the get, to flow in as a way of being a productive, functioning artist.
Well, it really seems like, I mean, just judging from the volume of work that he produced, that you all produced over the course of 20-some years, I mean, he seemed to be a very ambitious artist. Somebody was out there really wanting to work a lot. Is that true?
Out there wanting to be an artist, not so much. It's really more like his perfect space was inside the studio and just banging on metal and
Right.
I mean, that was actually his mantra near the end and stuff like that. What are we going to do today, Richard? We're going to go to studio and bang on metal.
Wow. Nice.
So but he was literally, whether he was on the phone doodling or and drawing and sketching, he was a proficient printmaker and a lot of 2D work as well. Early on in his career, he was doing a lot of clay and wax modeling, that ultimately were pieces that were transformed into through casting. And then, but ultimately, his main strive, in particular in the 20 years that I was with him, was fabrication. Direct metal fabrication is the way he would define it.
Okay.
Wow.
So when in your role in that, walk us through like one of the pieces that caught my eye just looking at stuff online was this Eternal Flame of Hope in front of Soldier Field.
Right.
I mean, well, walk us through how that came to be, if you would.
Yeah, so I mean, he had done a variety of pieces for the Special Olympics over the years.
Okay.
Awards and smaller installations, both at Soldier Field and other places. Ann Burke was a close friend of his, and she was actually one of the key people that actually started the Special Olympics.
Oh, in '68.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so, but anyway, so that he always had an affinity towards that, and so so they approached him and wanted to be, what could he do that would really kind of reach out and be a permanent placement, and with the idea of an eternal flame.
Yeah.
And so that was interesting as far as like all the mechanics that go into that,
Okay.
and plumbing and whatnot. So we actually hired a special burner guy,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's what he specializes in. Brian Swirsky, I think, was the
Okay.
name. But anyway, but as far as whether it's that piece or any other piece, he starts off with doing a series of maquettes. Initially in wax, I would pour out wax sheets, and he could fabricate the wax sheets in the same way he would fabricate, say, cardboard or or later the plate material that we'd use. So he would do smaller. He literally sketch in 3D in wax, get those going, and then once we kind of dialed those in and picked the best one or two, then we'd fab up and do something that more like 2 inches to 1 foot. But fabricate it out of sheets, so we'd get a sense of like how that's going to transform into using 7 gauge or 1/4 inch plate material in something that's going to be 20 feet tall.
Wow. So like 2 iterations of prototypes almost.
Yeah. So wax would be the first iteration, but also real loose and gestural, and then 1 or 2 fabricated forms. And I think for that one, we did 5 or 6 ones in stainless, kind of figuring out and dialing that in. And then ultimately, before executing it I think it's actually just shy of 20 feet tall.
No kidding. Wow. So do you as an artist utilize the same kind of hands-on materials, or do you rely on computer-aided type modeling as well?
I mean, I certainly have certainly through Richard and early teaching, been dialed into traditional materials, cardboard, clay, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so I definitely love digital and sci-fi and and technology and stuff. So I've always kept up on that.
Okay.
But for a long time, like even say if we talk about 3D printing, for the longest time, it was doable, but it was like $10,000 for a printer, but you could only print the size of a softball.
Right.
At that point, that's a toy.
Yeah.
As soon as it was, I guess it was probably about 2017 or 18. I came across a printer kit that suddenly had a build volume of about 300 by 300 by 400, so basically a foot by foot by about 16 inches. And I'm like, suddenly that was a maquette.
Yeah.
And so I bought this kit for $500, spent 3 months at night building a 3D printer. And that's how I kind of, got into that level of technology. So now I have a farm of like 10 printers.
Isn't that funny? So one of the things that amazes me about 3D is not so much, you get the idea of immediacy of fabrication. You need a part. You understand why that exists. But the ability to think in that way to create things that were not really cost effectively made before.
Right.
And, I've seen it in evidence through like an aerospace part where you've got these, just overlapping tubes and everything. Do you create art like that? Or are people utilizing 3D printing to create art?
Oh, very much so. And so the 3D printing was the first step, because that's just like I could play around with digital stuff, which I'd been doing since college. But there was always a disconnect of like, how do you take it from the digital to the real?
Yeah.
And so as soon as the printer came up, it's like, ooh, now I can actually really start playing with this. And so, but what really got my attention is that, you sit on at a monitor and whether you're working with CAD or whatnot, you have the monitor is a window into space. And as a 3-dimensional person, I can see an object rotating on it, and I can extrapolate pretty much what that's going to feel like in the real space, or like this piece that's on the table here. But there's still a leap of faith on what that means. So really the technology that I got into and I utilize heavily is actually working in VR and sculpting in VR.
Oh, wow.
And so And so in that space, I can either start with literally a digital ball of clay and start pulling and tugging at that. There are other objects I can do either in CAD and bring them into that virtual space, or there's some things I like for ceramics, I do these series of kind of pod pieces, but I can do those better on a wheel, traditional throwing of ceramics. And so I'll make things that way, but then 3D scan them and then take them into the digital space. But once I have all these objects in the digital space and stuff, I can manipulate them in real size. So like if I'm designing a piece that's this big, I can see it this big. If I want it to be 20 feet tall, I blow it up.
That's crazy.
And suddenly I can see it, in perspective in real time. And it's not quite like the Matrix and or Ready One or Player Ready One or whatever, and where it's super realistic and stuff like that. But your mind can look past those trappings pretty quickly, and it feels like it's a real thing.
Can you in any way simulate metalwork in VR at this point with any degree of accuracy?
What do you mean as far as actually welding two shapes together?
Right.
I mean, you don't need it's more of a clay thing.
Okay.
Would probably be the bigger analogy, and be able to push things together and merge them.
Sure. But the creation of shapes is the same.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. I can make anything I want and stuff, and that's how I approach all my art making, regardless of the process. Is that I am God of my realm.
Yeah. Right.
Not necessarily your realm, but it's like by my realm, I am God, and I can manipulate and create anything I want. I don't worry about the process. I worry about the idea first, and then I figure out who my audience is, and then I figure out the best material that day to convey that message.
Okay.
And sometimes it might be a brush, sometimes it might be a camera. Usually it's metal.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, so you've mentioned a couple of times your fascination with fire. I'm kind of want to go back to that in terms of your
Fire.
Beavis.
Head reference.
Yeah.
No, well, literally the first thing that comes to my head.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how does that manifest itself
well, right now, just since you started that in as a 10-year-old all the way up to now, the 50 years later, what are you looking at now, or how are you using it now, rather, in ways that you wouldn't have been?
Right. Yeah. I mean, to kind of get to the core of fire in general and stuff like that. So one of my early lessons with my dad was along with the stuttering, I also found myself as kind of an angry child and frustrated and whatnot. And so as a way to kind of get past that, one of my dad's projects, he introduced me to bread making, which also was real similar to ceramics. So the idea that you take a bunch of dry ingredients, you work them together, you set them aside, and have to wait there and let it do its thing. Then you work it a little bit more, maybe add a few more ingredients, set it aside, let it do its thing. Ultimately, when it's ready, you put it into an oven, and through heat, fire, it'll transform, and then you get this reward. You break it open, you eat it. It's like you critique it, you learn something, you set it aside, and you do it again. So we made bread every Sunday for several years when I was a kid.
Wow.
And then, so then that really, again, instilled that whole idea of okay, yes, there's the fascination of fire and watching things burn, or whether it's a campfire and whatnot, but realistically, it's how do you take a fire and manipulate materials with it? And so, certainly with, cutting and welding directly with straight fabrication, but also in particular with casting, the idea of taking something to a liquid, and then taking it back to a solid, has always been, and still intriguing to this day and stuff like that, still figuring things out. But yeah, so it's on the surface level, it's fire.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, it's like, what can we make and how do we manipulate fire for all of our different purposes?
Oh yeah, I mean, you've got all kinds of things on the videos I saw where you're pouring a lot of molten metal into multiple different things,
right.
Shapes and so forth. Is that something that you continue to major in, if you will, or is it just one of the things that you do?
I mean, it's one of the facets. I mean, I would say I'm at this point pretty even between fabrication and casting.
Okay.
My workflow for my current pieces, and of course the tail end, the last few pieces that I've done for Richard, in particular the memorial piece. We just finished a 22-foot tall. It's going to be his headstone.
Oh wow.
Here in Chicago, we'll install it later this summer, but. Yeah.
Where in Chicago is that going to be installed?
It'll be at the Oakwood Cemetery,
okay.
Down on 67th.
Wow.
So it'll be just down the street from the new Obama Presidential Center.
Sure.
Oh, wow.
And as it happens, right around the corner from Richard's childhood home, or one of his childhood homes.
Wow.
Richard and I started having conversations about his impending passing, and And so we were, it's like, okay, well, where are we going to plant him? His forever home, as the cemetery people like to say. And we looked at a couple different cemeteries, but we centered on Oakwood Cemetery down on 67th. And as we're driving around and stuff like that, they're like, oh, do you want to be by a wall? Do you want to be by a tree? And we're like, and Richard's like, we're looking for the best place for a sculpture. So we're looking for a mound or something that would give it a little more presentation. And they sold us a couple of plots kind of in the backside of the cemetery. And then it was, but when he passed and Richard's obit started popping up in newspapers all over the world, they're like, oh, this is who Richard is. And so now we're in the front of the cemetery. But also they were giving me a height limit in this other part of the cemetery. And I'm like, well, how big can I go in the front? And they're like, oh, you can go as big as you want now. And I'm like, well, okay. And I'm like, but I'm also talking to Richard because you don't always want to just like do big for big. It comes down to where it's going to be placed. And so, but ultimately his answer was like, make it as big as you can get away with. So, so we started there with it. So, initially when I kind of pitched it to the foundation and the people in charge of all that, it was going to be, 12 foot tall. And then it became like 16, 18. It's 22 and a half feet tall now. As far as actually the piece itself, if Richard approached me, it was just like, make me something cool for my headstone, and I'm like, well, I would love to make you something of my work, but that's not going to fly with who you are and where the funding's coming from and everything. So I was like, so let's start it off with maybe it could be a little storytelling of your arc of creativity over the years. And so we selected a series of sculptures. I 3D scanned them and then took those as elements. And then we kind of restacked them and worked on an overall. So it was a very much a collaborative, process. He was sitting next to me. I actually had him with the VR headset on so he could see it in perspective and get a sense of truly what it was going to feel like. And then when it came time to execute it, the base was a little more structural, and it's going to have 2 large plaques in it. The site we have actually, again, is about the size of this room. And so one side of it will have a more traditional plaque with a likeness of Richard and birth date, death date, maybe a cool quote, and there'll be a couple of benches. So if you want to go down and hang out and commune with Richard, pop a bottle of wine, and he was all about his wine, and go down and hang out with him and stuff, you'll have that opportunity. And then there's a sidewalk on the other side where the sculpture is going to be. There'll be a larger plaque. There'll be a educational moment, and talking about chronology and his history, and so people can roll up at the cemetery and be like, oh, what's this crazy ass sculpture? Oh, this is who Richard is. Because ultimately it is about legacy. It is about telling his story, creating this mythology. But once we actually had the piece, the more angular part of it, we had Vector Fabrication do for us, because like I said, we'd like to let them do the crispier, sharper, less fun things for us to do. Then the middle section of it, which is roughly about 7 foot by 7 foot by 7 foot, is very organic elements. And those are ones that, obviously we did in VR, a little more kind of clay-like. But then I 3D printed all those parts. It was over 100 parts. And because the printers I used for it are these bamboo printers, and so I'm limited to like a 10-inch by 10-inch cube build volume. So 100 of those pieces, then welded all those back together. And I can show you pictures of all that process. And then the top 10 to 12 feet is all fabricated out of 7-gauge and 11-gauge silicon bronze plate. And so utilizing his methodology of laying out patterns, and so I had a team of actually about 5 or 6 people helping me over the last 6 months to fabricate the top of this. So we were laying out cardboard patterns, laying them out, then stitching them all together. And then ultimately, once we got it mostly fabricated, and we started hitting the bridge crane, because the bridge crane only goes up to 21 feet. And like I said, it's about 22. So we actually had to lay it down and then finish it horizontally and then get it out the back door. And Richard's studio, it used to be an industrial area, but now it's all condos and houses and stuff. So it's squirrely to get out of his alley, but we got it out of there, and now it's sitting on a vector to age. And so we're finishing the plaques. I just got the engineering plans for the foundation. done. So now I need to deal with the contractors for that to get a foundation pour it, but we need to wait till probably a little bit more into the spring for the thaw. So we're hoping to get him, and Richard will ultimately be in the foundation planted underneath of it. So this will literally be his headstone or / memorial. And then we'll do a public dedication, hopefully maybe September-ish, maybe around his birthday.
And you and Richard also worked on a piece for the Obama Center.
Yeah,
too.
yeah, Bookbird.
Right.
Yeah, the piece for the Bookbird sculpture was originally for UNCF, United Negro College Fund, and it was an award that they did for a number of years. And then because of that history, the Obama Presidential Center, gravitated towards that piece because it's literally a bird being birthed out of a book or nesting in a book.
Is that yet on display?
No, it's still in storage. It's supposed to be installed maybe this month, but probably in March.
I see.
We finished it several years ago, and it's been in storage. But we were able to complete that before Richard passed.
Was was the original award designed by Richard?
Yeah.
Is that stainless bronze? What is it?
It's the picture in the final piece is bronze, and the award was cast bronze.
Okay.
It was the first piece we worked with Richard where we started incorporating the digital aspect of it. So instead of resculpting the bird itself, I 3D scanned the bird, and then we blew it up to 5 foot long by 3 foot by 3 foot, and I printed it in about 36 pieces, cast it, and then we assembled it all back together. And then the base was fabricated by Vector Fabrication here in Chicago.
Also friends of the podcast.
Yeah.
And then we merged those two together, and then Richard worked on the final finish and manipulating that even at, I guess he would have been 86.
Yeah. I was going to say, was that one of his final pieces that he actually...
Not the final piece, but yeah, it was in the last couple of groupings.
What an honor to do that for the Obama Center, too.
Yeah, no, Richard was super pumped to be able to be part of that project.
Yeah.
Did he know the president personally, or
he does now?
Oh, he does.
Yeah, so we wound up it was right on the tail end of COVID, so we met Richard. Oh, you have some of the video up. Yeah, so we originally met the president on via Zoom.
Okay.
And then later on, Michelle came in and spent a better part of an afternoon with us, and that was super cool.
Oh wow!
And then and Barack didn't meet Richard face to face until on Richard's deathbed.
Oh,
so
my.
4 nights before Richard died, I got a call from his people, and was just like, "Oh, we finally have a moment. We're in town. We want to have an informal visit with Richard. Can you make that happen?" And I'm like, "Well, of course." And so we worked it out with Secret Service. Got him into Richard's apartment building, up the freight elevator because no one needed to know.
Right.
And and brought him in, and he had a nice, probably an hour-long visit with Richard, and talking about this and that. And
4 days before he passed.
yeah,
My
That's
goodness.
awesome. So
story.
one of the projects you've worked on, I don't know, recently, but within the last year or so, is merging hybrids, where
right. That's actually one of my pieces.
yeah, but
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
I read on your Instagram that you're processing losing your friend and kind of pouring.
Yeah. It was
yourself.
definitely a grief piece. I mean,
Yeah.
the last few pieces I've done have been a mixture of how I've been, dealing with Richard's passing, and that piece specifically for my own work, and then ultimately doing, as I mentioned a little bit ago, the memorial itself.
Right.
The headpiece. Well, it's the headstone, which ultimately turned into a memorial.
Right.
Although Richard will be buried inside of it. But yeah, as far as my piece, Emerging Hybrid, that was a mixture of it's a fabricated stainless figure
Right.
on the lower side, and it always needed an arm I wanted reaching up into the sky. And then I went ahead and 3D scanned the existing 10-foot stainless sculpture, and then took that into VR, and then made this real organic flame-like element. And that was one of the first big pieces I did for myself, where taking that workflow of being in VR, printing in it, and then casting, and then assembling all those parts.
And there's such a dynamic between the two, whereas the elements of the bottom part, where you can see fabricated, right?
Yeah.
There's edges where the top is much more flowing. I thought male female when I was first looking at it.
Well, there's
the
certainly
dichotomy between the two. And actually, kind of seeing myself as the blockhead, trying to live up to the expectations of my wife. But it was the dichotomy of the two not only from the finish, but also from just the way they were sculpted.
The way they're sculpted, the way the materials themselves. Everyone has there's perception that steel or whether it's stainless or whatever is cold and lifeless, which it's not. Richard was always a proponent that one of the things he really liked about metal, in particular with bronze, even in some Corten and whatnot, is that it if you approach it right, it can be a very plastic material,
right?
A very fluid, malleable material.
You talked about your fascination with the human form and trying to inculcate that into a lot of your work over the years. It seems like I was looking at just a couple of your pieces of work, and the Eternal Flame, the Firekeeper's Flame in Battle Creek, Michigan, the Rising sculpture in Minneapolis. It seems a lot of that does have the connotation of movement upward. Right. Can you talk about that a little bit and why?
Yeah, I mean, for Richard, he always had he's a black man that lived and survived through tumultuous times in history and whatnot, and so there was always a very strong social justice, civil rights aspect to who he was. Now, to be fair and stuff like that, he was black and he was an artist, and he didn't really merge the two, but it was certainly a strong undercurrent. Yeah. And so the idea that he was always trying to not only better himself, but more in particular, he wanted the audience to strive towards making something better of yourself, and whether that was using imagery of wings, ladders. Or even certainly in his titles of rising and whatnot. But this idea of just moving up and
flight
and evolving.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
absolutely, that's fascinating.
And that's pretty much falls into the vast majority of his work. Now, the one kind of exception to that sort of is that people have this perception that when you talk about big sculpture, that automatically means tall sculpture.
Right.
And for him and so forth, a lot of his sculptures were actually linear, more horizontal. And so, which was always a really interesting, avocation of it. So it wasn't necessarily, reaching this way, but it could be reaching, sideways and outward. And,
of the river, mounds, and bridges in East St. Louis kind of fits that description. Yeah.
And one of his later ones at the National Museum of African American History.
Yeah, Swing Low.
Yeah. Is that still on display there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that like a permanent installation there?
Oh, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a piece he was, commissioned to do, but in the end, ultimately donated it to the museum.
Gotcha.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was a crazy execution.
Yeah. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah. So again, he started off in doing fabricated models for it, and we built up a model for scale, because that piece is 30 feet by 30 feet.
Oh my!
Which is what it needed to do to fill up that space.
Right.
But. So even the maquette, the architectural model for it would have taken up the better part of this room, and meanwhile it had that sculpture floating in the middle of it. But we made that out of a 1/4-inch plate, bronze, and then it literally we created a centerpiece, which was kind of boxy shaped, and then the lengths of the arms were determined on when we hit the walls in his studio.
Wow. So
we just made him it literally made it as big as his space at that time would accommodate.
My goodness.
So obviously it has to come apart for you to deliver,
we transported it in 5 or 6 different pieces. And so, like a lot of artists, we kind of work at last minute and kind of behind deadlines and whatnot. So we pulled 3 or 4 all-nighters to get it, basically done, threw it into a truck, and then 2 of us drove it from Chicago, leaving it like 10 at night, and deadheaded all to DC, took a nap, and then in DC you're only allowed to drive box trucks during the night. You're not allowed to drive commercial vehicles in the city during the daytime for security reasons. So we get to the Smithsonian at 4 a.m, start off loading, and then get everything loaded up, and it all suspended. So we had to I'd spent 6 or 8 months working with the architects and figuring out structural points in the ceiling that could handle the load.
Cables and
then
whatnot.
cables and stuff like that, and then setting up a winch system that once we assembled it on the ground, pulling it up into place and up and into the ceiling.
How did it fasten together?
Everything bolts in that centerpiece, but each arm was its own element.
Wow.
And so ranging from 12 to 15 feet long.
So you were involved in the rigging as well?
Well, once we were on site, we were advisors.
Okay. I
Yeah,
got
yeah,
you.
no,
Okay.
you know, and those, you know, most commercial projects, I would go in and we could be there and advising but it was all union.
Oh,
Gotcha.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, like Chicago.
I was,
Well, that one DC.
Yeah.
But yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's one thing that, you know, it's cool to make great big pieces of art, but then the execution of it to display it is, I don't think a lot of people really think about.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's like, none of this, you know, big stuff was taught in school.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you know, like I said, school kind of teaches you the premise of like what an artist could be, but the reality of it doesn't teach you like actually how to make a living as an artist.
Yeah.
You know, and it certainly actually doesn't tell you how to die as an artist. And that was actually been my education over the last few years since Richard passed. And how do you deal with legacy and the estate and all the objects that he made and everything else that's been going on. But
Well, not to get too terribly personal, but I mean, can you just touch on, you know, his influence on you and what it's meant to you, you know, since his passing, you know, trying to carry on that legacy?
I mean, when he first asked me, I guess it was probably about 5 years before he passed, to be his art trustee, you know, the idea of taking on that mantle. Because for the most part, he never really gave it much thought other than he would find that person to take on that role. His focus was always just make the art his himself. But at this point, I'd been working with him for 20 years, and I guess in some ways there wasn't really anyone else to ask. But yeah, I went ahead and took on that role, not knowing. I'm like, hey, Richard, so what's the general plan? I'm like, he overthinks everything. How are you gonna, you know? He's got to at least have basically a roadmap. You know, he's like, oh, my roadmap was to find someone like you. You're capable. You'll do a good job for me. Good luck. And I'm like, well, what's the overall goal? And he goes, well, I want to be Picasso. I want to be Van Gogh. I want to be a household name. And like, hey, I know it'll take a little bit, maybe 50 years and stuff. So you got some time.
Wow.
You know,
That's playing the long game.
yeah, let me know how it works out for you. You know.
Wow.
And so then it's just like, okay, well, how do we deal with this stuff? So, so I started working with the trust, and then ultimately we recently started a foundation, and we reached out and courted a number of galleries, but the trust and the foundation are now represented by White Cube Gallery, which is a London-based gallery, and then we've already done a series of solo shows in New York and London, next year Paris, to get Richard exposed out into the world. And all that's going really well, and we're starting to sell pieces. And so the legacy project is a 5-10 lifetime, you know, project, and that's ongoing.
So how are you handling that in addition to your own work?
Yeah, so my work is for most of those 20 years, I was able to run my studio pretty parallel with Richard's. You know, Richard and I would sit down at the beginning of the week. Whose deadline? I mean, his deadlines were always priority, but I was able to navigate my deadlines to be opposite of his. And so if I was jamming on my own solo show, he'd be like, get out, go finish your work, just come back. And so it was a pretty good balance. The last 7 years of Richard's career, both as kind of a physical wind down and then ultimately his passing, my studio's taken a back seat, at least to the creative aspect. I was still experimenting and figuring out the whole workflow for the digital stuff in parallel and some of that. But as far as the true creative output and putting myself going out after commissions and shows, that's been dormant as of until this week.
Oh, wow.
So we just officially closed Richard's studio a week ago.
No kidding.
And I've moved out of that. And like I said, there's ongoing projects we'll continue with, and including with, you know, doing a piece at Vector. But now it's like, now I need to figure things out and finally be back in my studio full time.
Wow.
Like I said, and my first day with that was yesterday.
Yeah. Is that part of the kind of grieving process? The physical?
No, most of the grieving process was done when I was executing, you know, hybrid, emerging hybrid and Richard's memorial piece.
Yeah.
To be fair, I'm not quite sure what grieving means.
Oh, no.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, it's like, you know, I mean,
all
obviously,
figure it
I'm
out.
sure everyone here has gone through it on one level or another. But, you know, it's like you watch TV and there's this, you know, well, on TV, everything has to be acted out so it can be perceived. And so, like, there's this presupposition that grieving is shaking or sweating or crying or all these, you know, physical outlays of it and stuff. And I internalize the crap out of everything. And so what is grieving, I'm not sure, but Richard always told me that after he was, because we talked about his passing quite a bit, or his impending passing quite a bit. Actually, one of the other pieces we did was a piece called night phlox, hybrid night phlox. And night phlox is a flower that blooms at night, and he was talking about that as an analogy to his impending passing. And so it was just like, make these pieces for me, these last few pieces, you will find me in the work.
Wow.
And that's certainly been the case. Wow. So I have a portrait of Richard up on the wall, and I still talk to him. I'm actually still in charge of his ashes, and so I knock on his urn quite a bit, and we have conversations. He's not as talkative as he used to be, but so I'm still processing. I think about him. I'm still very much saturated with that relationship.
How would you not be?
Yeah.
I mean,
So
working with him for.
Do you have one of the things, the dynamic between you and Richard, is it being replicated in a way? Are you working with other people in terms of
Mentorship
co-working, mentoring, or co-projects?
Yeah,
anything
no,
like that?
I have a crew.
Yeah.
I have a long history of taking on interns and training people up, and then they inevitably jump out of the nest and go do their own thing.
Right.
But they're anyway. So currently, I have like 4 or 5 people working for me, and I actually brought them with me to help me at Richards.
Yeah.
And then now that we're moved out of that space, so 3 of them are actually down at my studio right now,
Wow.
working on some stuff. We're going to an iron pour this weekend up in Madison.
An iron pour.
Yeah.
What explain that?
An iron pour. Iron pours are a community event. So whereas like aluminum or bronze, I can do that in my studio. I can fire up a pot, and 1 or 2 people, we can go ahead and pour metal. For the iron pour, we turn it into a community event. It winds up being anywhere from like 10 people to 50 people, and we're smashing up old radiators, bathtubs, sinks, and whatnot. Anything that's thinner casted metal that we can smash with sledgehammers. And then we have a furnace called a cupola that's fired. It's a coke-fired furnace. And once it's revved up, we can melt, in particular the furnace I have here in Chicago named Eleanor, kind of from the Gone in 60 Seconds reference. But anyway, she runs like a bat out of hell when she first starts off. But we can melt 100 pounds of metal every 10 minutes.
Wow.
And so when you start producing metal that quickly, you need to have 50 to 100 molds already prepped and stuff. So it's typically a 4 or 5 day event where there's 2 to 3 days of prepping all the molds, prepping all the materials, breaking the coke, breaking the iron, and then you have the day where you're actually melting everything down,
What day?
pouring it into the molds, and then the 5th day is breaking everything open, seeing what you get, and clean up.
Wow.
My pour is called the Carnival of Fire. And it's here and actually hosted at the Vector Fabrication Studio. And we do it out in their big courtyard. And mine is, it's kind of fluctuated through the year, but the last few years it's the beginning of October. And I think this year will be October 3rd.
Okay.
Wow. So do you create your own castings?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it's people making a variety of working in clay, and we'll do, a lot of the molds are sand casted. But then also the investment that I specialize in is ceramic shell. And so we'll have anywhere from 50 to 100 molds all prepped up. And then the iron cast, like I said, we tap out about 100 pounds of metal every time.
Wow.
And we'll pour, for my pour, it's a little bit smaller. We'll only do, 1,000, 1,500 pounds. Kelly's pour, we do somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds.
Okay. Wow.
And he runs also a sizable furnace where we actually are getting metal, that same 100 pounds every 4 minutes.
Oh, wow. Do you have to bring your own recycled metal?
Typically, we find it, and then we then sell it back to you break it down and sell it back to the artist. So we have kind of an ongoing call that as people are renovating their homes and they need their old radiators ripped out of their houses, we'll go in and take them out.
The molten cooperative.
I know Radiator in Crystal Lake, but it's in about 10 feet of water.
Yeah, it's a little.
People used to use it as a moor for their boats.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, well, yeah. Well, in that case,
A little hard to go get,
in that
I
case,
understand.
you need to
Yeah.
haul it back up
Yeah,
for us to come out and get it.
Lean on someone else to do that work.
But we'll go into people's homes, 3rd stories up, and deconstruct these things and take them out of their houses.
No kidding. Wow. I mean, that is a lot of metal, though.
Right, but at that point they need to give it to us.
Right.
You know, they're like, "Oh, well, we can get this for scrap." And I'm like, "Yeah, sure. You want to drag it down to the walk? You know, then we can have a conversation. But you want us to come into your house?
Yeah.
You know,
well,
you're
even
giving
up.
it. You're going to give it to us."
Project. So, what type of advice would you have for a young person who maybe wants to go into art, or maybe has a background in fab and wants to explore kind of their artistic side? What would you say to them?
Just do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like going,
Repeatedly? Repeatedly, though, right? I mean,
well, I mean, it depends.
it depends on their path, right?
Right. Yeah, it depends what you want to do and stuff like that. I mean, if your path is to make a living at it and for this to be your culture, it's every day.
Yeah.
Period.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, yes, you can take a little bit of time off and have some personal
Right.
life and balance and all
Right.
that kind of thing, but you need to truly saturate yourself about it.
And why is that so important? I think that's key to the way you've succeeded in your career.
Right. I think a lot of it comes down to is, well, I mean, part of it is it's the, like I said, I think it really comes into the play. So many artists will, you know, have this, or people in general have those aspirations, like, I want to be creative, but I'm not in the mood. I don't have the time. I don't do this. I don't do that. There's always an excuse not to do it. But if you get it let it permeate you on such a level that, you know, you can be creative at any moment in any media or any application. It just makes it easier that when you are finally in the studio and you have that moment and stuff like that, you can slide back into that in a more fluid way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Before we started formally recording this, we were talking about safety a little bit. From a safety aspect, you've learned that you want to protect yourself.
Right.
Why is that? And I assume you recommend people you're working with dealing with metal to take the steps necessary to make sure they're not inhaling what they shouldn't be inhaling.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, safety's a huge thing. I mean, when I was younger, did I wear all my safety gear? No.
Yeah.
Of course not. And so do I now have hearing loss? Yes. So I'm super adamant about hearing protection. With welding stainless and aluminum all these years, in particular stainless for Richard, the vaporizing of the nickel and the chromium have fried my throat. And so I'm hypersensitive to vapors in general, and whether it's solvents, wax fumes, smoke, and whatnot. So I wear a heavy respirator. And I know that having a beard is problematic for that conversation. Most people would be like, oh, you can't wear a respirator and have a beard. Yeah. So I do try to keep it as trimmed as much as I can, and I just crank it down. For the daily stuff, if I'm doing a bunch of hardcore welding, I wear a full space helmet, so everything's completely sealed in. Wow. So, and then of course eye protection and gloves and leather and stuff. So, you know, I mean, you're going to get UV. You know, or one of the side effects that people don't think about for stainless is that you're welding a big stainless sculpture and you're kind of in the midst of it. You're basically welding in a house of mirrors. Yeah. And so suddenly all that arc light is bouncing off of all these different surfaces. And so early on, I'd go home and be like, oh, I have all my gear, but the underside of my neck would be all sunburned.
Wow.
You know, so you're wearing like 100 SPF sunscreen on anything that might be exposed, and then on, you know, them layering all that with leather. And the same with foundry and stuff. We like if you go up to the up to Kohler, where they make the bathtubs and sinks, you know, you go into that shop, and a lot of them are actually in T-shirts and whatnot, but they're so glazed with sweat and oil that if metal hits them, it bounces right off of them.
Wow.
And they'll tell you that they won't wear a jacket because if something gets into their neck, it'll ricochet and they'll get more burns. But that's a unique industrial situation. Most of the casting things I'm doing, you know, teaching and mentoring and or we're doing these iron pours. And a side note with the iron pours is that it's all, you know, we invite everyone to come in, and whether they have skills or don't have skills, and we train them up. Right. You know, but we with that said, we wear, you know, extra layers of leather or silver suits and different things to protect us from, not so much from ourselves, but the stupid person standing next to you that doesn't know as much. And also we purposely have molds blow up and stuff. Some of them are accidental, some of them are on purpose, where it'll, you know, shoot up a canopy 30 feet in the air of vaporized iron. You know, which looks really cool.
By the way, it looks really cool.
Somehow or another, you still haven't grown up completely yet.
No, of course not. No. I would say that if you're asking about, you know, lessons for an artist, always figure out a way to maintain the aspect of being a 5-year-old in a sandbox.
Yeah.
Question, take risks. Don't worry about what's going to happen. You're going to make mistakes, of course. Is it going to look like crap half the time? Yes.
Right.
But you just keep playing and keep experimenting and stuff. So that's my goal at this point, as of yesterday, is to get back to figuring out how to be a 5-year-old.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Wow, that's really cool.
I thought it was interesting that, going back to that list that you made when you first moved to Chicago and were like working down, making cold calls and coming across Richard Hunt's name and not being familiar with who he was at the moment, but then seeing remember that sculpture that you walked by in Houston.
right.
What moment did you realize that you were working with somebody who had like a lot of significant influence in that art industry?
Yeah, no, I mean, as soon as I started redoing my research as soon as I was just like going, oh, I'm going to go meet Richard and stuff. But then I started doing my homework a little bit. It was like going, oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And started kind of, realizing some of that. And then of course, running around with him, the thing with, I started working with my dad when I was 10. And then I've worked, in a lot of ways, I'm a professional studio assistant. I've been working for artists all over the country, along with the different foundries I've been in. And so, but a lot of those shops, an artisan gives you a sketch, a blueprint, whatever, and stuff like that. And they're like, make me one of those. And you crank it out, whatever scale. And they're kind of around in the process, but it's a lot of hands off. Whereas Richard, probably the biggest analogy would be we were his nurses and he was the doctor. 80% of the time, I mean, there were certainly things we would do independently of him, but the vast majority, over 80% of what we did with him by our side. He was out in the shop. So he would draw patterns out in cardboard, and then we'd lay them out in metal, and we'd plasma cut them out and clean them up. And then he would forge the metal, or at least direct us on how to forge, depending on how big these things were. And then when it came time to lay the fresh piece onto another sculpture, he'd be like, okay, let's start, corner to corner here and do a tack. And then, we'd bend it in up that seam, do the next tack. And he was sitting there right on top of us with a hammer and massaging these two pieces of metal together, tack, weld, tack, weld, tack, weld. And sometimes they'd they'd line up perfectly. Other times they would be a little squirrely, and you're like cutting chunks out, as fabricators do and everything. But there were also, if it really just like, you're expecting it to lay together this way and it's like this, he'd be like, oh, we'll leave that as a detail. And then suddenly it would turn into something else. So he would create these situations that allowed the piece to evolve. It becomes something that he didn't anticipate, but that's where he found his play. That's where he was the 5-year-old.
Sure.
Let it organically become its own thing.
Right. And so he was constantly, and so I would say that, and you were asking me a little bit ago about, what biggest lessons, and this is really what I've been trying to, kind of latch on to as I move forward here with my career, is that, there was definitely a difference between being a representational artist and being an abstract artist. A representational artist, you can make something and it's like, oh, it looks like Lincoln. It looks like Michael Jordan. It looks like a duck. It looks like a dolphin. But when you see something recognizable in a piece, it gives you a context, and it already frames the conversation you're going to have as you're viewing that piece. With abstract art, good abstract art, it really is predicated on diving in and touching on the subconscious. I mean, there's a lot of abstract art out there they're just pretty objects. They move around, they're brightly colored, and they're cool pieces. But successful abstract art is and this is what Richard leaned into, was stuff that really, like I said, tugging at the subconscious. Maybe with a title to kind of nudge people into a certain visual direction or storyline. But it was really, that manipulation of the forms and playing with the positive and negative. Everything for Richard was an influence. Every Monday for so many years, I'd be at the computer and download his digital camera, or later phone, and literally thousands of images every week of anywhere from the clouds in the sky to the shadows on the ground to the tar patterns where they were fixing the cracks in the asphalt. Just everything was an influence. And so down all that, I would print out contact sheets for everything, and then he'd circle, and I'd print everything out, because this is where his old school, I'm like, Richard, we have this on the computer. He goes, I'm not on the computer. So I'd print out, he's like, oh, but give me 6 of these and 10 of these. And and whatever. And so he could put them in his files. And then when he was talking with friends or clients and be like, and he wanted to reference something, he would give them, copies of these different images, so it could, facilitate his conversation. So again, it comes into this, like, everything's an influence, everything's a reference, everything, it's like the saturation.
Right. That true creative thinking in every little aspect of your
and
day.
so those are all the different aspects. I mean, they've always been a component of my life, instilled with me from my dad, but super reinforced with Richard. Right. And of course, now that's really what I'm trying to embody, or continue to embody as much as I can moving forward. And of course, what I'm now instilling into my interns and studio assistants.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Well, I think you said representational art and abstract. Did he kind of like blur the lines between those two things?
I mean, he did a few figurative pieces in commissions and stuff, but they were still pretty abstracted.
Yeah.
I mean, with my work, I do, it is figurative based, but it's still abstracted and stuff. So like, currently my workflow is I'm working with live models. I'm actually 3D scanning the models, then taking those digital forms into the computer and basically armoring them with this kind of crystalline matrix. Huh. And so there's elements where the real bodies are protruding out of that armor, that abstraction, and some different things. So
sure. Well, because I know one of the pieces that put him on the map was Hero's Head, that sculpture of Emmett Till.
Yeah, and that was one of his first pieces that he gas welded when he first got because up to that point, his early metal work was lead solder and wire. And there's several examples of that in the modern wing down at the Art Institute. But he would take these kind of more carnival, lighthearted performers and stuff like that pieces, and we're selling them in local art fairs. And then when he got enough money, he bought his first oxyacetylene torch. Okay. But it was also correlated right around about the time that Emmett Till was murdered, and Richard was at the open casket, service, and so which radically influenced his work and his direction, imagery-wise. And so, Hero's Head is a huge pivotal piece in that, or it's almost a keystone in his career. And then one of the next manifestations of that was Hero Construction, which is actually down at the Art Institute on the grand staircase as you enter the front of the building. And so, his early ability to, manipulate and work with the oxyacetylene torch, and not only as a cutting tool or a bending tool, but actually using the surface tension of the metal in concert with the flame of the torch to actually move the metal around like a plastic material. Yeah. Was always fascinating, and it's surprising. I mean, that piece is only about this big, but it takes up visually, conceptually, a much larger space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because he cut his teeth as just a welder, right, to begin his metalworking career.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Yeah. Early on, I mean, it was just him. Like any artist, we all start off as individuals, and it wasn't until he, got his studio maybe at Cleveland Street, but I think it was Little Street, where he really started like expanding and having assistants and really diving into the public works. Because I think he did 100. I think the promo and everything, the legacy says 160. I think we're actually higher in that number as far as but he's created the largest number of public works for an artist at least in the U.S.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, it says like 170 solo exhibitions.
Right. Yeah, he's already in museums all across so it's like people are like, oh, they bought up his pieces, and then the pieces are sitting at dormant in the bowels of the building, but now that Richard, has passed, and it's like, oh, and we're raising his legacy back up, and so people are like, oh, we should get a Richard. Oh no, we already have one. And so we're getting all this
kind of
attention, and so now that's actually where my position will shift, and I'll start renovating and or reconditioning these older pieces of Richard's as a way to maintain his legacy, because it's like that's the best thing I can do at this point is to help shepherd how his work is going to be perceived.
Absolutely.
The actual storyline and everything else that around it, that's up to scholars and critics and to figure all that stuff out. But since working side by side with him for so long, that's really going to be how I since we're not going to be making any more sculpture, transition to actually maintaining and now I'm starting to lose my train of thought. But yeah, maintaining and making sure that the work can be perceived in its best possible light.
Sure. Right. Yeah, I think you guys have done an incredible job with the legacy and the website. And I was talking with John Ott too.
Yeah, John Ott. Yeah,
and he actually just emailed me back while we were recording here. And I was like, oh yeah, we're actually talking to Eric today. He goes, well, that's the guy I was going to recommend that you speak to. But
I talked to him last week, and he thought it was like, oh yeah, I got this weird email from this fabrication thing, and I'm like, I'm already talking to him. I'm going in next week. He's like, oh, that's great.
Yeah, it was a weird email. I was like, this is what we do, and this is why we want to talk to somebody at the Richard Hunt Legacy Foundation, and so we're glad that got contact with you.
Yeah. This actually, it's perfect timing. Obviously, I love talking about with Richard, and certainly his influence on me. This is, it's a fun point to be in.
We're glad to have you here because you elevate our conversation.
Yeah.
Yes, greatly.
Beyond Beavis and Butthead references.
Well, you know what? Some people need help. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Eric.
Oh yeah, no, this has been a pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
It's been fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, where can they find out more about you and your studio?
Right now, YouTube, Lunar Burn Studio on YouTube is probably one of my main platforms, at least for the educational aspect in casting. Eric W. Stephenson on Instagram is probably my primary thing at the moment. I am trying to get my website back up and running and everything, which is ericwstevenson.com and everything. But so yeah, Lunar Burn or Eric, one way or the other. I mean, I'm out there.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Thanks, Lincoln.
Yeah,
thank you to everyone else. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any comments, criticisms, or complaints, send them to Lincoln at podcast@fmamfg.org, and he'll appreciate that.
I will.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, and tune in next time. Thank you, and goodbye.
The Fabricator Podcast is a production of Fabricators and Manufacturers Association, located in Elgin, Illinois. The show is hosted by Dan Davis and the staff of FMA Communications. The podcast is produced by Gareth Slager and recorded and edited by Griffin Hammond and Dana Weicker. Sales support provided by Andy Flando. Additional production support by Elizabeth Gavin, Mike Owens, Billy Kolpa, Pat Simon, Brandon Geyer, and me, Sarah Spring. Email us at podcast@fmamfg.org. Thank you for listening.
Oh, the Beards and Glasses podcast?